The afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of the St. Mary Mead Village Hall, casting delicate patterns across the polished wooden floor where the ladies' auxiliary had arranged their monthly tea gathering. Miss Jane Marple sat in her customary corner chair, her knitting needles clicking in a gentle rhythm as she worked on what appeared to be a baby's booty, though her pale blue eyes missed nothing of the social tableau unfolding before her. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, resplendent in her best floral dress, presided over the silver tea service with the authority of someone who had organized such gatherings for the better part of 3 decades. The familiar faces of St. Mary Mead's feminine society clustered around small tables draped in crisp white linen, their conversations creating a pleasant hum of village gossip and gentle observations about the unseasonably warm weather. "I do hope Mrs. Fortescue won't be much longer," Mrs. Bantry announced, glancing at the ornate mantel clock that chimed 3:30. She specifically requested we wait for her before beginning the raffle for the Church Restoration Fund. Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Emmeline Fortescue, the recently widowed owner of Rosehill Cottage, was renowned for her punctuality, a trait that had made her indispensable as the village's former postmistress. Her absence was as notable as a missing note in a familiar melody. "Perhaps she's been delayed by that nephew of hers," suggested Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, lowering her voice to a confidential whisper. "Young Mr. Geoffrey arrived from London yesterday, quite unexpectedly. Caused quite a stir at the railway station, I'm told." Mrs. Clement, whose husband served as the village doctor, nodded knowingly. Emmeline mentioned he'd been having some difficulties. "Financial troubles," she hinted, though she was too loyal to say much more. Miss Marple observed the subtle exchange of glances between the women, noting how Mrs. Hartnell's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of financial difficulties, while young Mrs. Prothero, the vicar's wife, looked genuinely concerned. Human nature, she reflected, was remarkably consistent in its responses to the mention of money troubles. "There's also that business with Mr. Slack from the Building Society," added Mrs. Hartnell, unable to resist contributing her own morsel of information. "He was seen leaving Rosehill Cottage yesterday afternoon, looking rather grim." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Tommy, the butcher's boy, who burst through the hall doors with the breathless urgency of youth. "Begging your pardon, ladies," he gasped, "but Mrs. Fortescue's asked me to give you this note." Mrs. Bantry accepted the envelope with a frown, her expression growing more puzzled as she read its contents. "How very odd," she murmured. "She says she's feeling rather unwell and asks us to proceed without her, but she particularly mentions that she's prepared. Tea for one at home and expects a visitor who might be able to join us later." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their steady rhythm, though her attention sharpened considerably. The phrase, "tea for one," struck her as peculiar. Mrs. Fortescue was known for her generous hospitality and would never prepare such a modest refreshment for a guest. "Who might the visitor be?" inquired Mrs. Clement. "She doesn't say," Mrs. Bantry replied, refolding the note. "Simply mentions that it's someone she hasn't seen for many years." The ladies proceeded with their gathering, but Miss Marple noticed a certain restlessness in the atmosphere. Conversation seemed more forced, glances more frequent toward the windows that faced the direction of Rosehill Cottage. When the clock struck 4 and no visitor had appeared, Mrs. Bantry suggested that perhaps someone should check on their absent friend. "I should be happy to walk over," offered Miss Marple, setting aside her knitting with deliberate care. "The fresh air would do me good, and Emmeline might appreciate some company if she's feeling poorly." Mrs. Clement volunteered to accompany her, and together they made their way along the familiar lane that led to Rosehill Cottage. The small dwelling sat prettily behind its white garden gate, roses climbing the trellis in perfect order, everything appearing exactly as it should on a peaceful afternoon in St. Mary Mead. The front door stood slightly ajar. Miss Marple's steps slowed as they approached, her experienced eye noting the unusual detail. Mrs. Fortescue was meticulous about security, a habit formed during her years handling the village mail. She would never leave her door open, even on the warmest day. "Emmeline," Mrs. Clement called softly as they entered the small hallway. The sitting room beyond was arranged with Mrs. Fortescue's characteristic precision, but the scene that greeted them was anything but ordinary. A single place setting sat on the small round table by the window. Delicate china cup and saucer, silver teaspoon placed just so, a small plate with 2 digestive biscuits arranged with geometric care. The teapot, however, lay overturned on the carpet, its contents forming a dark stain on the Persian rug. And beside the table, in her favorite armchair, sat Mrs. Emmeline Fortescue, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her kind eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling, her face bearing an expression of profound surprise. Mrs. Clement's sharp intake of breath broke the terrible silence. Miss Marple moved forward with careful steps, her gaze taking in every detail of the scene, the positioning of the furniture, the state of the tea service, the curious absence of any sign of struggle. "We must telephone the police at once," she said quietly, though her mind was already beginning to catalogue the small inconsistencies that would, she suspected, prove far more significant than they initially appeared. The tea for one at Rosehill Cottage had become something far more sinister than a simple afternoon refreshment. Within minutes of Mrs. Clement's trembling telephone call, the peaceful afternoon at Rosehill Cottage transformed into a scene of official activity. Inspector Reeves arrived from Much Benham with Sergeant Mills, both men bringing the kind of methodical efficiency that Miss Marple had observed in countless investigations over the years. The inspector, a careful man in his 50s with graying temples and intelligent eyes, nodded respectfully to Miss Marple as he entered the sitting room, having learned from previous encounters to value her seemingly innocent observations. Dr. Clement followed closely behind, his medical bag in hand, and his expression grave. He knelt beside Mrs. Fortescue's chair with practiced professionalism, his examination thorough yet respectful. "No obvious signs of violence," he murmured to Inspector Reeves, though his frown suggested the matter was far from straightforward. "The positioning is somewhat unusual for a natural collapse, and her expression—" He trailed off, shaking his head slightly. Miss Marple remained near the doorway, her presence so unobtrusive that the investigators seemed to forget she was there entirely. This suited her perfectly, allowing her to observe not only the physical evidence, but the subtle reactions of those who had begun to gather outside the cottage gate. Word travelled with remarkable speed through St. Mary Mead, and already familiar faces pressed against the garden fence, with expressions ranging from shocked concern to poorly concealed curiosity. The sound of hurried footsteps on the garden path announced the arrival of Geoffrey Fortescue, Mrs. Fortescue's nephew from London. He appeared breathless and genuinely distressed, his usually immaculate appearance dishevelled, dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that made him appear younger than his 30-odd years. His reaction upon seeing his aunt's still form seemed entirely natural. A sharp intake of breath, a stumble backward, genuine tears gathering in his eyes. "I came as soon as I heard," he said to Inspector Reeves, his voice thick with emotion. "Mrs. Bantry sent word. I'd just stepped out for a walk to clear my head." Miss Marple observed the young man with the same attention she might give to a particularly complex knitting pattern. His grief appeared authentic, yet something in his manner suggested an underlying tension that went beyond natural shock. His eyes darted frequently to the overturned teapot, and she noticed how his hands trembled as he accepted condolences from Dr. Clement. "When did you last see your aunt, Mr. Fortescue?" Inspector Reeves inquired, producing his notebook. "This morning at breakfast. She seemed in excellent spirits, actually. Mentioned she was looking forward to the ladies' auxiliary tea." Geoffrey paused, his voice catching slightly. "She also said she might have a visitor later, someone she hadn't seen for years, someone who might bring news that would change everything." Inspector Reeves examined the overturned teapot with professional interest. Yet she prepared tea for only one person. Rather unusual if she was expecting company. Aunt Emmeline was very particular about presuming upon guests, Geoffrey replied quickly. She would never assume someone's appetite or preferences. Miss Marple's needles had resumed their gentle clicking as she worked on her knitting, though her attention remained sharply focused. She preferred shortbread fingers to digestive biscuits, she mentioned mildly, noting how Geoffrey's eyes immediately shifted to the small plate beside the chair. Yes, she did, he confirmed, then flushed slightly. I mean, she always said digestives were too plain for proper tea service. The contradiction was subtle but telling. Miss Marple filed it away alongside other small inconsistencies she had begun to catalogue. The afternoon post lay unopened on the hall table, unusual for someone as methodical as Mrs. Fortescue. A single muddy footprint marked the otherwise pristine kitchen floor, though the day had been entirely dry. Most curious of all, the back door key hung on its usual hook, yet the door showed signs of recent use despite Geoffrey's assertion that his aunt had been expecting her visitor through the front entrance. Meanwhile, the gathering crowd outside had grown considerably. Mrs. Hartnell stood in animated conversation with Mrs. Price from the bakery, their voices carrying fragments of speculation through the open windows. Young Mrs. Prothero appeared genuinely distressed, while Mrs. Bantry paced nervously, still clutching the mysterious note that had excused Mrs. Fortescue from the afternoon's gathering. Inspector Reeves completed his preliminary examination and addressed the assembled group with professional gravity. I'm afraid we must treat Mrs. Fortescue's death as suspicious. The circumstances suggest this was not a natural passing. The announcement sent ripples of shock through the village observers, though Miss Marple detected an undercurrent of excitement beneath their horror. St. Mary Mead now had a genuine mystery unfolding on its doorstep. We'll need to speak with anyone who visited Mrs. Fortescue recently, the inspector continued. I understand Mr. Slack from the Building Society called yesterday, and there may have been other visitors. Geoffrey shifted uncomfortably. There was a woman last week, Mrs. Arden, I think her name was. She used to work under Aunt Emmeline at the post office years ago. Said she wanted to make amends for something, though I didn't hear the details. Miss Marple's attention sharpened at this revelation. Past associations, in her experience, rarely surfaced in the present without significant purpose. She noticed how Geoffrey's gaze avoided the overturned teapot entirely now, as if the sight caused him particular distress. As the official proceedings continued around them, Miss Marple found herself drawn to seemingly insignificant details that others overlooked entirely. Near the table leg, almost invisible against the Persian rug's intricate pattern, lay a tiny curl of navy wool. The silver-framed photograph on the mantel showed signs of recent handling, its edges freshly polished where dust should have gathered. The mysterious visitor who never arrived, the tea prepared for one, the overturned teapot in an otherwise undisturbed room, these elements whispered of secrets that death had interrupted but not necessarily silenced. Miss Marple lowered her eyes to her knitting, reflecting that human behavior was remarkably like needlework. A single dropped stitch could reveal where the entire pattern had gone awry, if only one knew where to look for it. The investigation at Rosehill Cottage continued with methodical precision as Inspector Reeves directed his attention to the physical evidence while the village buzzed with speculation beyond the garden gate. Dr. Clement completed his preliminary examination, his professional demeanor masking a growing concern about the circumstances surrounding Mrs. Fortescue's death. The positioning of her body, the expression of surprise frozen on her features, and a faint but unmistakable odor that reminded him of bitter almonds all suggested that this was far from a natural passing. Miss Marple remained unobtrusively in the corner, her knitting needles clicking softly as she observed not only the official proceedings, but the subtle reactions of those present. Geoffrey Fortescue's genuine distress was evident, yet she noted how his eyes repeatedly avoided the overturned teapot, as if the sight caused him particular discomfort. When Inspector Reeves questioned him about his whereabouts that afternoon, his response carried the ring of prepared truth rather than spontaneous recollection. I walked down to the old quarry path. Geoffrey explained, his voice steady but his hands trembling slightly. I needed to clear my head about some business matters. I met no one who could verify my presence there, I'm afraid. The arrival of Mr. Slack from the Building Society added another layer of complexity to the afternoon's revelations. The portly man appeared genuinely shocked by the news of Mrs. Fortescue's death, yet his explanation of yesterday's visit seemed carefully rehearsed. Miss Marple's keen eye caught a small detail that others missed entirely, a tiny fiber of navy wool clinging to the brass button of his waistcoat, distinct from the material of his own clothing. Mrs. Fortescue had written regarding some wartime certificates. Mr. Slack explained to Inspector Reeves, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. A simple clerical matter that required correction. I assured her it could be resolved without difficulty. Yet you appeared rather agitated when leaving yesterday, Miss Marple observed mildly, her tone suggesting nothing more than polite curiosity. Mrs. Price from the bakery mentioned you seemed quite disturbed. Mr. Slack's flush deepened. Financial irregularities, even minor ones, are always distressing to discuss with clients. Mrs. Fortescue was understandably concerned about the implications. The conversation was interrupted by Sergeant Mills, who had completed his examination of the kitchen and back entrance. Sir, there's a single muddy footprint by the back door, quite fresh. The mud appears to be from the brook path rather than the main road. There's also evidence that someone used the back entrance recently, despite the front door key hanging in its usual place. Miss Marple's attention sharpened at this revelation. Mrs. Fortescue was meticulous about her routines, and she would never have used the back entrance when expecting a formal visitor. The contradiction suggested either that the mysterious guest had arrived unexpectedly or that someone else entirely had accessed the cottage through the rear. As the afternoon progressed, the crowd outside the cottage grew larger and more animated. Mrs. Bantry had appointed herself unofficial coordinator of village concern, while Mrs. Hartnell and Mrs. Price exchanged increasingly elaborate theories about the tragedy. Their conversations, drifting through the open windows, provided a fascinating commentary on village psychology. That nephew has always been trouble, Mrs. Hartnell declared, with the authority of someone who had observed Geoffrey's periodic visits over the years. Coming down from London only when he needs money, mark my words. But what about Mr. Slack? Mrs. Price countered. Building society managers don't make house calls unless there's serious business involved. And he looked positively thunderous when he left yesterday. Miss Marple found their certainty both amusing and instructive. Each woman viewed the situation through the lens of her own experiences and prejudices, creating theories that fit their established understanding of human nature. Yet in their gossip lay kernels of truth that the official investigation might overlook. The discovery of a visiting card near the front gate provided another piece of the puzzle. Inspector Reeves examined the small white rectangle with its neat inscription, L. Arden. The card showed signs of recent handling, though it had clearly been exposed to the elements for some time. Mrs. Arden visited last week, Geoffrey confirmed when shown the card. She claimed to have worked with my aunt at the post office years ago, said she wanted to make amends for some past disagreement. They spoke privately, and Aunt Emmeline seemed quite unsettled afterward. Miss Marple's memory stirred at the mention of the name. Lottie Arden had indeed worked at the post office during the war years, a young woman with quick intelligence and an unfortunate tendency toward petty dishonesty. Her departure from the village had been sudden and unexplained, leaving behind whispers of missing postal orders and uncomfortable questions that were never satisfactorily answered. The physical evidence continued to accumulate throughout the afternoon. The teapot's position suggested it had been deliberately overturned rather than accidentally knocked over. The tea service, while appearing to be set for one person, showed subtle signs of hasty rearrangement. Most telling of all was the small milk jug, its presence contradicting Mrs. Fortescue's well-known preference for taking her tea without milk. As the official investigation continued, Miss Marple quietly excused herself to examine the garden more closely. The back path showed clear signs of recent use, with disturbed gravel and a broken rose stem that suggested hurried passage. Near the garden gate, she discovered another fragment of navy wool caught on a thorn, confirming her growing suspicion that someone wearing a dark cardigan had recently visited the cottage. The afternoon's revelations painted a complex picture of Mrs. Fortescue's final day. The mysterious visitor who had never arrived, the financial irregularities discussed with Mr. Slack, Geoffrey's convenient absence during the crucial hours, and the physical evidence of someone using the back entrance all suggested a carefully orchestrated deception. Yet Miss Marple sensed that the true solution lay not in the obvious suspects, but in the subtle inconsistencies that revealed the difference between appearance and reality. As evening approached and the official investigation wound down for the day, Miss Marple reflected on the curious case of the tea prepared for one that had somehow accommodated preferences that were not Mrs. Fortescue's own. In her experience, such contradictions often pointed toward the heart of human deception, where the smallest details could unravel the most elaborate schemes. The following morning brought a grey sky that seemed to mirror the somber mood settling over St. Mary Mead, though the village's collective fascination with the mystery at Rosehill Cottage had only intensified overnight. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, and positioned herself at her front window where the view across the lane provided an excellent vantage point for observing the renewed activity at the scene of yesterday's tragedy. Inspector Reeves had returned with Dr. Clement and a small team from the county constabulary, their official presence transforming the quiet cottage into the center of a formal murder investigation. The confirmation came within the hour, delivered by Dr. Clement with the grave precision of a man who had hoped his initial suspicions would prove unfounded. The bitter almond scent he had detected the previous afternoon was indeed significant. Mrs. Fortescue had been poisoned with cyanide, most likely administered in liquid form through her tea. The revelation sent fresh shockwaves through the assembled villagers, replacing speculation with the chilling certainty that a murderer walked among them. Miss Marple absorbed this news with the calm attention she might give to a particularly complex knitting pattern, though her mind immediately began cataloguing the implications. Cyanide was not a poison of passion or sudden impulse. It required planning, access, and a cold determination that spoke to premeditation rather than momentary rage. The method also suggested someone familiar with Mrs. Fortescue's habits, someone who knew she would be alone and vulnerable at the crucial moment. The morning's most significant development came with the arrival of Mrs. Lottie Arden herself, approaching the cottage gate with the determined stride of someone steeling herself for an unpleasant but necessary confrontation. Miss Marple observed the woman with particular interest, noting the navy cardigan that showed a small tear near the left sleeve, precisely where wool fibers might catch on a garden thorn. Mrs. Arden's appearance had the worn quality of someone who had lived through considerable hardship, though her bearing retained traces of the quick intelligence that had once made her an efficient postal clerk. "I've come to speak with Inspector Reeves," Mrs. Arden announced to Constable Williams, her voice carrying the careful pronunciation of someone who had worked to improve her station in life. "I understand there are questions about my visit to Mrs. Fortescue last week." Miss Marple, having volunteered to bring tea for the investigators, positioned herself where she could observe the subsequent interview without appearing intrusive. Mrs. Arden's account carried the ring of partial truth, carefully edited to present herself in the most favorable light while revealing deeper currents of old resentment and unresolved grievances. "Emmeline and I had a disagreement years ago concerning some missing postal orders during the war," Mrs. Arden explained, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "She believed I'd taken them, which I had not, but the suspicion was enough to force my departure from the village. I came back to make peace with her, to explain what really happened, and to clear my name at last." Inspector Reeves leaned forward with professional interest. "And what did really happen, Mrs. Arden?" The hesitation was barely perceptible, but Miss Marple caught it. The postal orders were taken by someone else entirely, someone in a position of trust who allowed me to bear the blame. I had proof, finally, after all these years. Documents that came to light when my late husband's effects were sorted. The interview was interrupted by Geoffrey Fortescue's arrival, his appearance considerably more composed than it had been the previous afternoon, though Miss Marple detected an underlying tension that suggested the night had brought little rest. His greeting to Mrs. Arden carried polite recognition tinged with something more complex, a shared knowledge that neither seemed willing to fully reveal. "I remember you from the post office," Geoffrey said carefully. "You left rather suddenly, as I recall." "Circumstances forced my departure," Mrs. Arden replied, her tone neutral, but her eyes flashing with old resentment. "Your aunt was very quick to believe the worst of people in those days." As the formal interviews continued, the forensic examination of the cottage yielded discoveries that painted an increasingly clear picture of deliberate murder. The overturned teapot and its contents were carefully collected for analysis, while a thorough search revealed a small, empty vial tucked into the back of a kitchen drawer. The vial had been wiped clean, but a faint, acrid smell still clung to its interior, and its size was consistent with containing the liquid poison that had claimed Mrs. Fortescue's life. Miss Marple reflected on the significance of this discovery as she observed the various reactions around her. The killer had remained in the cottage long enough not only to administer the poison, but also to attempt concealment of the evidence, suggesting either remarkable composure or dangerous familiarity with the victim's routines. The careful staging of the tea service, with its telling inconsistencies, spoke to someone who understood the importance of creating a specific impression while overlooking the small details that revealed the truth. The afternoon brought yet another revelation when Mr. Edmonds, Mrs. Fortescue's elderly solicitor, arrived with information that added a crucial new dimension to the investigation. His professional gravity was evident as he addressed Inspector Reeves with obvious reluctance. "I felt it necessary to inform the authorities immediately," he explained. "Mrs. Fortescue recently made substantial changes to her will, changes that significantly alter the distribution of her estate. The bulk of her property now goes to charitable foundations, with only a modest annuity remaining for her nephew." The implications of this revelation rippled through the assembled group like stones dropped in still water. Geoffrey's face paled visibly, though whether from shock or the exposure of a known motive remained unclear. Mrs. Arden's reaction was more subtle but equally telling, a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested the news was not entirely unexpected. As evening approached and the official activities wound down, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the intricate web of relationships and motivations that had culminated in murder. The missing postal orders from 20 years past, the recent will changes, the mysterious visitor who had never arrived, and the carefully staged tea service all formed pieces of a puzzle that was beginning to reveal its pattern. In her experience, the present was often merely the final act of dramas that had begun years earlier, when pride, greed, and human weakness had planted seeds that would eventually bloom into violence. The revelation about Mrs. Fortescue's altered will had cast a shadow of suspicion over Geoffrey that seemed to deepen with each passing hour. Yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by details that suggested a more complex deception than simple financial murder. While Inspector Reeves focused his attention on the obvious motive of inheritance, she quietly pursued the small inconsistencies that whispered of careful planning and deliberate misdirection. Her first significant discovery came through Mrs. Bantry, who arrived at Miss Marple's cottage that evening with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Jane, I've been examining that note from yesterday," she announced, settling into the familiar chair by the window. "Something about it has been troubling me all day, and I finally realized what it was." Miss Marple set aside her knitting with the careful attention she reserved for truly important moments. "What did you notice, my dear?" "The paper, for one thing." Emmeline always used her cream writing paper with the small rose watermark. You know the kind. But this note was written on ordinary lined paper, the sort one might buy at any shop. And the ink. Mrs. Bantry paused, frowning. It was violet, with a slightly perfumed quality. Emmeline always used blue-black ink from that little china well-shaped like a robin. The implications of this observation sent Miss Marple's mind racing through possibilities. A forged note would explain the curious phrasing about tea for one that had struck her as so uncharacteristic of Mrs. Fortescue's careful hospitality. It would also suggest that someone had gone to considerable trouble to ensure the ladies' auxiliary would be gathered elsewhere during the crucial hours. The handwriting seemed quite natural, though. Mrs. Bantry continued, not obviously disguised or anything of that sort. Handwriting can be practiced, Miss Marple observed mildly, though her thoughts were far from mild. Someone had taken the time to study Mrs. Fortescue's writing style, to acquire the proper materials, and to craft a message that would effectively remove potential witnesses from the scene. This level of premeditation spoke to a killer who was both patient and methodical. The following morning brought additional confirmation of her growing theory when she encountered Tommy, the butcher's boy, loading his delivery bicycle outside the shop. A gentle inquiry about his activities the previous afternoon yielded information that proved far more significant than the boy realized. "I did see someone leaving Mrs. Fortescue's cottage," Tommy admitted, his young face creased with the effort of remembering. "Just as I was coming up the lane with the note. They went out the back way, moving quite quickly, like they didn't want to be seen, wore a dark coat and kept their head down." Miss Marple thanked him warmly while filing away this crucial detail. Someone had been at the cottage during the time when Mrs. Fortescue was supposedly alone and unwell. Someone who had used the back entrance and departed hastily when Tommy's arrival threatened to expose their presence. Her subsequent examination of the cottage's rear garden, conducted under the pretense of offering assistance to Inspector Reeves, yielded further evidence of the killer's careful planning. Near the brook path, she discovered a short length of brown paper caught on a hawthorn branch, along with the remnants of string that bore traces of red sealing wax. Most telling of all was a cigarette end, discarded in the long grass, with the neat, square-cut filter that marked it as an expensive London brand, quite different from the rough, hand-rolled cigarettes favored by local men. Inside the cottage, Miss Marple's attention was drawn once again to the tea service that had been so carefully arranged on the small table. The milk jug continued to puzzle her, not merely because Mrs. Fortescue never took milk in her tea, but because its presence suggested someone else's preferences had influenced the scene's composition. The digestive biscuits, too, seemed wrong for a woman who had always favored shortbread fingers for her afternoon tea. "It's curious," she mentioned to Inspector Reeves, her tone carefully casual, "how people's habits become so fixed. Emmeline always said digestives were too plain for proper tea service, yet there they were on her plate." The inspector nodded absently, his attention focused on more obvious evidence, but Miss Marple recognized the significance of these small departures from established routine. The killer had attempted to create a believable scene of Mrs. Fortescue taking solitary tea, but had unconsciously incorporated their own preferences into the arrangement. As the investigation progressed, the pressure on both Geoffrey and Mrs. Arden became increasingly apparent. Geoffrey's financial difficulties, confirmed by discreet inquiries, provided a motive that seemed to satisfy the authorities' need for simple explanations. Mrs. Arden's presence in the village, coinciding so closely with the murder, made her an equally compelling suspect, despite her claims of seeking reconciliation. Yet Miss Marple observed how both responded to the mounting suspicion with reactions that seemed genuine in their distress. Geoffrey's grief appeared authentic, untainted by the guilt she had learned to recognize in truly guilty parties. Mrs. Arden's defensive anger carried the ring of someone who had suffered unjust accusation before and feared experiencing it again. The afternoon brought an unexpected development when Mr. Edmonds, the solicitor, returned with additional information about Mrs. Fortescue's recent activities. She had been making inquiries about certain wartime irregularities, he revealed reluctantly. Insurance policies processed through the post office during the 1940s showed discrepancies that suggested systematic fraud. She was quite determined to see justice done, regardless of how long ago the crimes had been committed. This revelation added another layer to the complex web of motives surrounding the murder. Someone with knowledge of wartime postal procedures, someone who had profited from those long-ago crimes, would have compelling reasons to silence Mrs. Fortescue before her investigations could expose their guilt. As evening approached, Miss Marple reflected on the emerging pattern of evidence. The forged note, the carefully staged tea service, the hasty departure by the back path, and the connection to wartime crimes all pointed toward a killer who was both methodical and desperate. The solution, she sensed, lay not in the obvious motives of money or revenge, but in the careful analysis of small deceptions that revealed the difference between appearance and reality. The morning brought fresh revelations that seemed to crystallize around the wartime fraud investigation, yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly drawn to smaller, more personal details that others continued to overlook. Her first significant discovery came through a visit to Mr. Pritchard's stationer's shop, where a casual inquiry about unusual ink purchases yielded information that sent her thoughts racing in an entirely new direction. "Violet ink, you say?" Mr. Pritchard's face brightened with the pleasure of helpful recollection. "Indeed, I had a most particular request just last Friday. A gentleman from London, by his manner and speech, wanted something a lady might use. Very specific about the scent. Violets, old-fashioned style. Paid in cash and insisted on lined paper rather than our superior cream stock with the rose watermark." He paused, frowning slightly. "Tossed one of those square-ended cigarettes right by my door. I swept it up myself." The implications struck Miss Marple with the force of recognition. Someone had deliberately purchased materials to forge Mrs. Fortescue's note. Someone familiar enough with feminine preferences to request perfumed ink, yet unfamiliar enough with Mrs. Fortescue's actual habits to choose the wrong paper and scent. The London cigarette connected directly to the expensive filter she had discovered by the brook path, suggesting their mysterious gentleman had indeed visited Rosehill Cottage. Her subsequent examination of the cottage, conducted under the pretense of offering assistance to Inspector Reeves, revealed additional evidence of careful manipulation. The silver-framed photograph on the mantel, which Geoffrey had admitted to turning, showed signs of more extensive handling than his simple explanation suggested. Behind the frame, Miss Marple discovered minute traces of red sealing wax and the faint impression where documents had recently been pressed against the backing. Someone had used the photograph's concealment to hide papers, then hastily removed them when discovery seemed imminent. The afternoon brought an unexpected encounter with Mrs. Clement, who arrived at the cottage bearing what she described as a comfort casserole for Geoffrey during his time of grief. Miss Marple observed the doctor's wife with renewed attention, noting details that had previously seemed merely characteristic quirks. Mrs. Clement's navy cardigan showed a small repair near the left sleeve, expertly darned but still visible to a careful eye. Her manner of speaking carried subtle traces of nervousness, particularly when discussing Mrs. Fortescue's recent activities. "Poor Emmeline was quite agitated during her last week," Mrs. Clement remarked, accepting the offered cup of tea with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. She mentioned discovering irregularities in old insurance records, said she intended to see justice done regardless of the consequences. As she spoke, Mrs. Clement added milk to her tea with practiced ease and selected a digestive biscuit from the plate. Preferences that Miss Marple noted matched exactly those reflected in the crime scene staging. The conversation was interrupted by Mr. Slack's arrival, his usual pompous demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety. His revised account of his business with Mrs. Fortescue painted a picture of institutional involvement in the wartime fraud that went far deeper than initially suspected. She had evidence of systematic manipulation of insurance claims during the war years, he admitted reluctantly. A building society processed many of those policies, and she was threatening to expose what she called a network of corruption that had operated with impunity for decades. Miss Marple listened to these revelations with the careful attention she gave to complex knitting patterns, noting not only the information conveyed, but the subtle reactions of those present. Mrs. Clement's face had paled slightly at the mention of insurance fraud, while Geoffrey appeared genuinely surprised by the scope of his aunt's investigations. Most telling was Mrs. Clement's unconscious gesture of touching her cardigan's repaired sleeve when Mr. Slack described the urgency of Mrs. Fortescue's intended revelations. As the official investigation continued around them, Miss Marple quietly pursued her own line of inquiry. A visit to Mrs. Clement's home, ostensibly to discuss the church flower arrangements, provided an opportunity to observe the doctor's wife in her natural environment. The small writing desk in the sitting room contained the expected array of correspondence materials, including a box of lined paper and a bottle of violet ink, whose stopper had been recently disturbed, releasing the same faint perfume that had characterized the forged note. "I do hope this dreadful business will be resolved soon," Mrs. Clement remarked, preparing tea with her customary attention to detail. Miss Marple watched as she added milk to both cups without asking preference, then offered digestive biscuits with the casual assumption that they would be welcome. These small actions, so natural and unconsidered, spoke volumes about ingrained habits that might unconsciously influence more deliberate deceptions. The accumulating evidence painted a picture of meticulous planning combined with subtle, personal reveals that the planner had been unable to entirely suppress. The forged note had been crafted with materials chosen to suggest feminine authorship, yet the specific choices reflected the forger's own aesthetic preferences rather than the victim's known habits. The crime scene had been staged to suggest solitary tea-taking, yet incorporated elements: milk jug, digestive biscuits that catered to tastes other than Mrs. Fortescue's well-documented preferences. Evening brought a final revelation when young Mrs. Prothero arrived at the cottage with a small bouquet of late roses, her gentle nature compelling her to offer comfort even in the face of tragedy. Her observation, delivered with innocent directness, provided the clearest confirmation of Miss Marple's growing suspicions. "She never took milk in her tea," Mrs. Prothero whispered, her eyes fixed on the evidence table where the crime scene's tea service remained arranged for examination. Everyone knew that about Mrs. Fortescue. She always said milk clouded both the flavor and the mind. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm as she contemplated the web of evidence that was finally beginning to reveal its true pattern. The solution lay not in the obvious motives of inheritance or revenge, but in understanding how someone's desperate need to protect a carefully constructed life had driven them to eliminate the one person capable of exposing decades-old crimes that continued to provide comfortable security in the present. Morning light washed the village in pale clarity as Miss Marple took her customary walk past the Green Man, where newcomers tended to lodge. Her timing was impeccable, as always. Mrs. Lottie Arden emerged from the inn with a sensible handbag and an expression that mixed determination with deep fatigue. The older woman's approach seemed to offer exactly the kind of gentle conversation that might ease the burden of returning to a place that held such painful memories. "My dear, how fortunate," Miss Marple said with gentle brightness. "I was hoping for a word, only to save you from needless discomfort. Villages can be rather hard on returning daughters." Lottie's shoulders eased visibly at the kindness in Miss Marple's tone. "You've always had a way of saying things that carry more kindness than they sound, Miss Marple." She hesitated, then added with quiet dignity, "I didn't come back to make trouble. I had a letter. It said if I presented myself to Mrs. Fortescue, the truth of the old business would be allowed to stand at last." Miss Marple's attention sharpened with interest. A letter, such a sensible method. One spares embarrassment in the street. Was it scented by any chance? Violets, perhaps? The question clearly startled Lottie. Yes, exactly. Violet ink as well, rather old-fashioned. No signature, only a friend of justice. I thought it must be someone from those days, grateful to be rid of lies at last. As they walked together, Lottie spoke in the economical sentences of someone who had learned to preserve dignity through careful truth-telling. She had told Emmeline everything during their meeting, about odd entries in wartime insurance forms, about officials who double-signed claims, about small sums that became substantially larger when nobody looked too carefully. She had not made direct accusations, merely pointed to patterns and discrepancies that spoke for themselves. Most significantly, Emmeline had shown her a flat brown parcel tied with red sealing wax, then carefully positioned it behind the silver-framed photograph on the mantel. Safe here, Emmeline had declared with firm satisfaction. Tonight I shall write to Mr. Edmonds. This must be done properly, through official channels. The morning's revelations continued when Miss Marple encountered Mr. Pritchard at his stationer's shop, where her casual inquiry about unusual ink purchases yielded crucial information. Violet ink, you say? His face brightened with helpful recollection. Indeed, most particular request just last Friday. A gentleman from London, by his manner and speech, wanted something a lady might use. Very specific about the scent. Violet's old-fashioned style. Paid in cash and insisted on lined paper rather than our superior cream stock. The implications struck Miss Marple with crystalline clarity. Someone had deliberately purchased materials to forge Mrs. Fortescue's note. Someone familiar enough with feminine preferences to request perfumed ink, yet unfamiliar enough with Mrs. Fortescue's actual habits to choose entirely wrong materials. The careful planning suggested not passion, but cold calculation. Her subsequent visit to the cottage, ostensibly to assist Inspector Reeves, revealed additional evidence of systematic deception. Behind the silver-framed photograph, minute traces of red sealing wax still clung to the backing, along with a faint, rectangular impression where documents had recently been pressed. Someone had used this hiding place exactly as Lottie described, then hastily removed the contents when discovery seemed imminent. The afternoon brought Mrs. Clement to the cottage, bearing what she described as a comfort casserole for Geoffrey during his bereavement. Miss Marple observed the doctor's wife with renewed attention, noting details that had previously seemed merely characteristic. Mrs. Clement's navy cardigan showed expert darning near the left sleeve, precisely where wool might catch on garden thorns. Her manner carried subtle nervousness, particularly when discussing Mrs. Fortescue's recent investigations. Poor Emmeline was quite agitated during her final week, Mrs. Clement remarked, accepting tea with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. She mentioned discovering irregularities in old insurance records, said she intended to see justice done regardless of consequences. As she spoke, Mrs. Clement added milk to her tea with practiced ease and selected a digestive biscuit, preferences that matched exactly those reflected in the crime scene's careful staging. The conversation revealed deeper currents when Mrs. Clement continued. She said she had proof that would shock the entire village, evidence that someone we all trusted had been living a lie for decades. The comment carried apparent innocence, yet Miss Marple detected underlying anxiety, suggesting Mrs. Clement knew far more about those irregularities than she cared to admit. As afternoon progressed toward evening, the peaceful investigation was shattered by the piercing shriek of fire engine sirens, an alarming sound rarely heard in St. Mary Mead's tranquil lanes. Black smoke plumbed ominously from Rosehill Cottage's direction, sending residents rushing toward the scene with genuine alarm, replacing their earlier morbid curiosity. Miss Marple arrived to find firefighters battling a stubborn blaze that had erupted specifically in Mrs. Fortescue's study. targeting the precise area where old files and correspondence would have been stored. Inspector Reeves, his face grimed with soot, directed operations while a weary firefighter reported clear evidence of arson with accelerant used to ensure thorough document destruction. Amidst the controlled chaos, Miss Marple observed crucial reactions. Geoffrey stood pale and genuinely shaken, muttering about senseless destruction of his aunt's cherished possessions. Mrs. Arden watched with strange mixture of fear and grim satisfaction, as if confirming darkest suspicions. But Mrs. Clement's reaction proved most revealing. She stood slightly apart, hands clasped tightly, gaze fixed not on roaring flames but on Inspector Reeves, calculating something with nervous intensity. "This is dreadful," Mrs. Clement exclaimed, voice pitched too high. "Who would do such a thing? Someone trying to cover their tracks, connected to those old wartime frauds Emmeline was investigating." She cast pointed glances toward Mrs. Arden, attempting to direct suspicion with theatrical obviousness. Miss Marple recognized the performance. Desperate misdirection by someone whose carefully constructed life was crumbling. The fire wasn't merely evidence destruction, but active manipulation, designed to frame Mrs. Arden while eliminating proof of decades-old crimes. The real killer was playing a far deeper psychological game than anyone had yet realized. The acrid smell of smoke and charred paper lingered in the evening air as the fire brigade completed their grim work at Rosehill Cottage. What had once been Mrs. Fortescue's orderly study now gaped like a blackened wound, its contents reduced to ash and twisted metal. Inspector Reeves stood amid the devastation, his face streaked with soot, directing the methodical collection of evidence, while Miss Marple observed from her position near the garden gate, her keen eyes noting not only the physical destruction, but the telling reactions of those gathered to witness this latest tragedy. The fire had been set with deliberate precision, accelerant poured strategically to ensure maximum destruction of documents, while leaving the rest of the cottage relatively intact. Fire Chief Morrison confirmed what everyone suspected. This was arson, carefully planned and executed by someone familiar with both the cottage's layout and the location of Mrs. Fortescue's most sensitive papers. The timing, too, spoke of calculated desperation, occurring in the narrow window between the constabulary's departure and full darkness. Mrs. Clement's performance throughout the evening struck Miss Marple as particularly theatrical. "This proves someone is desperate to hide their crimes," she declared with carefully modulated distress, her pointed glances toward Mrs. Arden transparent in their intent. "First poor Emmeline is murdered. Now someone tries to destroy the evidence she gathered. We're dealing with a truly ruthless criminal." Yet Miss Marple observed how Mrs. Clement's eyes avoided the cottage's damaged interior, how her hands trembled not with shock, but with the nervous energy of someone whose carefully orchestrated plans were spiraling beyond control. The fire had been intended to eliminate evidence while casting suspicion elsewhere, but the obvious nature of the arson had drawn unwanted attention to the very documents it was meant to destroy. The evening's most significant development came when Mr. Edmonds arrived with disturbing news. "I expected a packet from Mrs. Fortescue," he told Inspector Reeves, his professional composure barely concealing his anxiety. "She telephoned the evening before her death to say she was dispatching crucial material by hand rather than ordinary post. This morning I found only an empty envelope in my letterbox, addressed in her handwriting but slit neatly at the side." Miss Marple's attention sharpened at this revelation. Someone had intercepted Mrs. Fortescue's carefully prepared evidence, someone with access to postal deliveries and the knowledge to act swiftly. The implications painted a picture of systematic interference that went far beyond the single act of murder. Additional confirmation came from an unexpected source when Mrs. Prothero, arriving with genuine concern for Geoffrey's welfare, provided a crucial piece of the puzzle. "I saw Emmeline by the green the day before she died," she recalled with innocent directness. "She carried a brown paper packet under her arm. Quite flat, tied with string and red wax. Mrs. Clement came by with her bicycle and offered to save her the walk to the post office. I thought how fortunate it is to have helpful neighbors. The observation struck Miss Marple with the force of recognition. Mrs. Clement had volunteered to post the very evidence that would later disappear from Mr. Edmonds's letterbox, positioning herself perfectly to intercept communications that might expose decades-old crimes. Meanwhile, the forensic examination of the fire's remains yielded one crucial survivor, a warped metal biscuit tin that had somehow weathered the flames beneath a fallen beam. Inside lay a single, half-charred slip bearing Mrs. Fortescue's careful notation, "Counterfoil nose, 4351, double-signed, Clerk's Mark M." Such a small fragment to have escaped destruction, yet it provided the clearest link yet to the wartime insurance fraud that had motivated murder. Dr. Clement's arrival from his evening rounds added another layer of complexity to the unfolding drama. His protective concern for his wife seemed genuine. "Margaret, you shouldn't be breathing this smoke with your respiratory condition." Yet Miss Marple detected underlying tension that suggested private conversations had already touched upon dangerous topics. The doctor's trained eye would naturally notice behavioral changes in someone he knew intimately, and his growing unease was becoming increasingly difficult to conceal. As the crowd finally dispersed, Miss Marple found herself in quiet conversation with Inspector Reeves, sharing observations that had been accumulating throughout the investigation. "The forged note troubles me most," she confided. It required intimate knowledge of feminine correspondence habits, yet incorporated preferences entirely wrong for Emmeline. Someone who understood the importance of scented ink and careful penmanship, but had never paid attention to Emmeline's actual preferences. The inspector nodded thoughtfully. "Our inquiries confirmed someone purchased violet ink and lined paper with deliberate intent to deceive." "Indeed, but consider who would naturally think in terms of what a lady might use when making such purchases," Miss Marple continued, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. "The killer made assumptions based on general feminine habits rather than specific knowledge of the victim." Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Clement's approach, her manner now carrying obvious strain, despite continued attempts at helpful cooperation. "Inspector, I've been thinking about those insurance documents. During the war years, so many of us helped with processing claims and correspondence. Perhaps the fraud was more widespread than initially suspected." Her words carried the careful neutrality of someone attempting to diffuse responsibility across a broader group, yet Miss Marple detected the underlying desperation of someone whose individual guilt was becoming increasingly difficult to conceal. The fire had been intended to eliminate evidence, but its failure had instead focused attention on fragments that painted an unmistakable picture of systematic theft disguised as clerical efficiency. As the evening settled into uneasy quiet, Miss Marple reflected on the intricate web of deception that was finally beginning to unravel. The solution lay not in dramatic confrontation, but in recognizing how a lifetime of careful respectability had been built upon foundations that would crumble once exposed to honest scrutiny. Tomorrow, she decided, would bring the final test of her theory through the most revealing examination of all, watching how someone behaved when they believed themselves unobserved, yet under subtle pressure. The morning after the fire brought a deceptive tranquility to St. Mary Mead, though Miss Marple sensed the underlying tension that rippled through the village like a current beneath still water. She had spent the early hours in careful consideration of her growing certainty about the killer's identity, weighing each piece of evidence against the accumulated patterns of human behavior she had observed over decades of quiet investigation. The time had come for what she privately termed her final test, a delicate psychological examination that would either confirm her theory or reveal new truths entirely. By mid-morning, she had dispatched young Tommy with several carefully worded invitations for afternoon tea, couched in terms of discussing ways to honor Mrs. Fortescue's memory and providing mutual comfort during these difficult times. The guest list was deliberately selective. Mrs. Clement, Geoffrey Fortescue, Mrs. Arden, and Mr. Slack, along with Inspector Reeves, whom she had privately advised that observation might prove more valuable than interrogation. Miss Marple's sitting room arranged itself with its familiar charm. Violet cushions in their accustomed places, china as delicate as eggshells catching the afternoon light, and a small side table by the window where she had positioned a flat brown paper parcel tied with string, its red sealing wax broken to suggest it had already been examined. The parcel lay innocuously among the tea things, yet its presence seemed to draw the eye with magnetic insistence. Mrs. Clement arrived first, her navy cardigan neat and freshly pressed, though Miss Marple's keen eye noted the expert darning at the left sleeve where wool might catch on garden thorns. Her manner carried studied normalcy, yet beneath the surface, composure lay the brittle quality of someone maintaining control through sheer force of will. "Such a thoughtful idea, Miss Marple," Mrs. Clement said, settling into her chair with practiced grace. "We all need comfort during these dreadful times. I do hope this business will be resolved soon. The uncertainty is so distressing for everyone." Geoffrey followed, pale and hollow-eyed, his grief evident in every gesture. Mrs. Arden entered quietly, her dignity intact despite the renewed suspicion that had fallen upon her since the fire. Mr. Slack appeared perspiring and anxious, his eyes immediately drawn to the mysterious parcel with proprietary unease. Inspector Reeves positioned himself unobtrusively beside the bookcase, appearing more guest than official observer. Miss Marple poured tea with deliberate care, inviting Mrs. Clement to assist with the service as naturally fell to capable hands. Without being asked, Mrs. Clement added milk to 2 cups and arranged digestive biscuits as if such choices were entirely natural. The small actions, so automatic and unconsidered, spoke volumes to Miss Marple's trained observation. "I've been reflecting on dear Emmeline's habits," Miss Marple began conversationally, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. So particular about her routines, wasn't she? Never took milk in her tea, everyone knew that about her. Always said it clouded both the flavor and the mind. Yet that afternoon, she let the observation drift toward the brown parcel like smoke seeking air. Mrs. Clement's teacup rattled almost imperceptibly against its saucer. Perhaps she was accommodating her expected visitor's preferences, she suggested quickly. One often prepares refreshments to suit guests rather than oneself. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed mildly, though the note she sent excused her from our gathering mentioned tea for one. Such a curious phrase for someone expecting company. And written on lined paper with violet ink, quite unlike her usual cream stationery with the rose watermark. The comment produced a barely perceptible tightening around Mrs. Clement's eyes. Miss Marple continued with apparent innocence. "I often think scent can be misleading in correspondence. It suggests one person while belonging to another entirely. Rather like that expensive cigarette found by the brook path. Not the sort village men smoke, but perhaps purchased by someone thinking carefully about impressions in shopkeepers' minds." As conversation flowed around the room, Miss Marple rose to adjust a window latch, asking Mrs. Prothero, who had arrived to help with plates, to fetch a fresh saucer from the kitchen. In that brief moment of ordinary bustle, she left the brown parcel unattended, observing from the corner of her eye how attention focused upon it. Geoffrey's gaze remained fixed on his aunt's memory, while Mrs. Arden watched faces with the wariness of someone who had suffered false accusation before. Mr. Slack stared determinedly at his knees, but Mrs. Clement, with the unconscious tidiness of a house-proud woman, reached toward the parcel as if to straighten its position, her fingers lingering on the loosened string, a heartbeat too long before she caught herself, and withdrew. "How helpful you are, my dear," Miss Marple observed warmly upon her return. "I do rely on such capable hands." The conversation turned to wartime memories, and Mrs. Arden spoke hesitantly of the anonymous letter that had summoned her back to the village, violet ink on lined paper, promising that old wrongs would finally be acknowledged. Mr. Slack winced visibly at the mention of scented stationery, while Mrs. Clement, before anyone else could respond, remarked that some ladies still preferred such traditional touches, then colored as if she had revealed more than intended. "I always find assumptions about feminine preferences so interesting," Miss Marple mused. Someone purchasing materials for a lady's correspondence might choose violet ink and careful penmanship, yet select entirely wrong paper if they didn't know the particular lady's established habits. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the psychological pressure in the room became almost tangible. Mrs. Clement's composure showed increasing strain. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her teacup, and her attempts to direct suspicion toward Mrs. Arden carried the desperate quality of someone whose carefully constructed defenses were beginning to crumble. When Miss Marple casually mentioned that not everything had been destroyed in the fire, that prudent Emmeline had made duplicates of the most telling evidence, Mrs. Clement's reaction was immediate and revealing. Her cup rattled audibly against its saucer, and her gaze fixed upon the brown parcel with unmistakable recognition and fear. The final test was approaching its inevitable conclusion, as Miss Marple had known it would. Human nature, in her long experience, was remarkably consistent in its responses to pressure, and the small, unconscious habits that revealed character were impossible to suppress entirely, even under the most careful self-control. The afternoon light seemed to thicken around the small gathering as Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care, her pale blue eyes fixing upon Mrs. Clement with the gentle intensity that had unraveled countless deceptions over the years. The brown parcel on the side table appeared to pulse with significance, drawing every gaze while the doctor's wife sat frozen in her chair, her teacup trembling in hands that could no longer maintain their practiced composure. "You know, Margaret," Miss Marple began with deceptive mildness, "I've been reflecting on the curious inconsistencies surrounding poor Emmeline's final afternoon. Such small things, really, yet they whisper of careful planning disguised as spontaneous tragedy." Mrs. Clement's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. "I don't understand what you mean." "Oh, I think you do, my dear. Consider the tea service, for instance. Emmeline never took milk in her tea. Everyone in the village knew that particular habit. Yet there sat the milk jug, and you've just added milk to your cup quite automatically, as if such preferences were entirely natural. The digestive biscuits, too, when Emmeline always favoured shortbread fingers for proper tea service. These weren't Emmeline's choices, were they? They were yours, revealed unconsciously in the very staging of the scene." The room had grown absolutely still, each person sensing the approaching revelation, while Mrs. Clement sat rigid, her carefully maintained facade beginning its inevitable collapse. "Then there's the matter of that note excusing Emmeline from our gathering," Miss Marple continued with inexorable gentleness, "written on lined paper with violet ink, so unlike her cream stationery, with the rose watermark. Mr. Pritchard remembers a gentleman from London purchasing just such materials, specifically requesting something a lady might use. But you, Margaret, are a lady who does use violet ink and lined paper. Your writing desk betrays such preferences, doesn't it?" Mrs. Clement's face had gone ashen, her lips moving soundlessly as the web of evidence tightened around her. The wartime insurance fraud that Emmeline discovered, systematic alterations to death benefits, counterfoils double-signed, modest sums becoming substantially larger when processed through official channels. You had perfect access during your post office years, didn't you? The money helped establish your comfortable life with Dr. Clement, providing the respectability that meant everything to you. Inspector Reeves stepped forward slightly, his presence now unmistakably official, while Geoffrey stared in growing horror at this trusted family friend. When Emmeline threatened to expose the truth, you acted with cold calculation. You wrote that anonymous letter to Mrs. Arden using your own stationery preferences, summoning her back to provide the evidence that would damn you. Then you forged Emmeline's note, ensuring she would be alone and vulnerable. Mrs. Prothero saw you offer to post Emmeline's packet to Mr. Edmonds. Such a helpful gesture that allowed you to intercept the very evidence that would destroy you. Miss Marple's voice carried quiet authority now, each word falling with the weight of absolute certainty. You visited through the back entrance, prepared her final cup of tea with your own unconscious preferences, because old habits are impossible to suppress entirely. The cyanide was easily acquired, so simple for a doctor's wife to obtain, citing photographic chemicals or pest control. Mrs. Clement's composure finally shattered completely. She was going to destroy everything, she cried, her voice thin and desperate. My marriage, my position, my entire life, over money taken from insurance companies that could afford the loss, money that helped families who needed it. But it wasn't your decision to make, Miss Marple replied with gentle firmness. And when the murder wasn't enough, you set that fire, targeting Emmeline's study to destroy remaining evidence. Yet even in your desperation, you left traces. The navy wool from your cardigan caught on the garden thorn, the muddy footprint from the brook path, the paraffin-soaked basket behind your own garden shed. The confession poured forth with desperate relief. The careful planning, the systematic deception, the deliberate attempts to cast suspicion on both Geoffrey and Mrs. Arden. She had lived for decades on stolen money, building a respectable life on foundations of fraud, and when exposure threatened, she had chosen murder to protect her carefully constructed identity. Inspector Reeves stepped forward with quiet authority. Mrs. Margaret Clement, I arrest you for the murder of Mrs. Emmeline Fortescue. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence. As Mrs. Clement was led away, her dignity intact despite her circumstances, the room sat in stunned silence. Geoffrey wept openly for his aunt and for the trusted friend who had betrayed that trust so completely. Mrs. Arden stared at her hands, vindicated at last, but taking no pleasure in another's downfall. Miss Marple resumed her knitting with steady hands, reflecting on the tragedy of a life built upon deception, finally collapsing under its own weight. Pride and respectability, she murmured to Inspector Reeves as the room gradually emptied. Such powerful motivations, and so often the foundation of the most carefully planned crimes. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, the village began absorbing this latest revelation. The tea for one at Rosehill Cottage had revealed far more than anyone anticipated, exposing decades of hidden crime beneath the veneer of comfortable village life. Miss Marple sat by her window, needles clicking softly in the gathering dusk, reflecting that human nature remained as revealing as ever, and that the smallest inconsistencies often pointed toward the greatest truths about the human heart.